This is Villain for All Seasons. I'm Ben.
I'm down.
Today we're talking with Thomas Handischiegal. Tom is working in real estate on Wall Street, but he used to be a trader on Wall Street. So we pick his brain about that. And then we pick his brain about basically just the world at large. It's a good conversation. Hope you enjoy. Everybody, I want to welcome back Tom Handischiegal to Villain for All Seasons. Tom, do you want to give a little introduction to yourself?
I work in real estate, but my background, I was a stockbroker, in sort of like what I think is the last era when there were like real brokers left. But I did not get that whole experience, but I was kind of the tail end of what that looked like. And as the deep discount broker just took over and it became the likes of Robinhood that we see today. And so really the only functional stockbrokers are more people who work for hedge funds as professional traders. But for the most part, everything's automated. So the role doesn't exist anymore. So it's a very dinosaur kind of thing. But the principles still hold true.
Ben and I were talking right before this interview of that we're kind of sick of talking about tariffs, but if only because we don't know anything about it and really how it affects our financial situation. So we want some financial advice, and there's no other person I'd really want to talk to other than you. But before we dive into that, do you have just like a broad overview of what's going on this week?
I don't think I can give a broad overview of what's going on other than I think it's, well, just there's the Cliff Notes version that I find kind of interesting is that the Trump policy, which is obviously subject to change by the second, is effectively where we were at what Bernie Sanders was advocating in the early days of NAFTA. So it's this idea, like obviously the U.S. always has trade deficits. They aren't necessarily grim. Even putting some manufacturing offshore is not necessarily an issue. The problem now, though, is we are in a spot where we're a country that actually cannot make any product at all other than like defense. And even components of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and defense contractors and defense corporations are effectively offshoring a lot of their process as well. And so at some point, we're not even going to have making the weapons here. And there is a point of concern potentially, even right now, even drug companies are now basically moving their manufacturing to Asia, including the European companies. So we're looking at like the world's products being made in one place predominantly. So in terms of tariff policy, I think it's fairly backward on the surface of it, but I think you kind of, historically, we've needed some element of tariffs to incentivize people for buying our goods, but also to incentivize American corporations to actually make product here again. So I don't think it's as simple. There's not really Cliff Notes version that I can say because this week also everything's all over the map. I mean, even down to the policy as soon as something changes. Like no, even people within the administration don't really know what the policy is right now. But I do think it's kind of where the left used to be in terms of policy and wanting to have a manufacturing base. But now it's like I'm just surprised even like the unions are kind of like giving sort of inconsistent information on it as well, because really any manufacturing union should be like totally for this. I'm not necessarily for it as someone who invests and trades in the stock market, and I think the short-term pain could be really heavy for people. And it's, as always, the people making these decisions are not the ones who have to bear the brunt of it. So I do understand. I guess this is not me clarifying at all, but
No, but
Could I,
go ahead, Ben.
sorry, could I jump in with something? It's just, you said short-term pain, and that's being said a lot right now. And I don't think I've actually heard somebody say, how short-term is that? I mean, does that mean a couple weeks? Does that mean a couple months? Does that mean 15 years until there's factories? Like,
let's say Trump doesn't blink. We could basically get our manufacturing up within a matter of months. Because if companies like NVIDIA is already talking about making hardware in the US, like they're already talking about like supercomputer manufacturing here. NVIDIA stock happens to be down, at least before I had a meeting right before this. At least when I checked earlier, I lost money on NVIDIA. But NVIDIA is committed to bringing, so they're sort of are trying to get in front of it already. And I'm sure you guys heard the DeepSeek thing with AI, and that kind of tanked NVIDIA. This is before all this happened. But the irony is that DeepSeek may be making this up and they're using NVIDIA hardware for their AI anyway. But anyway, so yeah, so the short term could be anything from a few months to a few years. But if Trump doesn't blink and US corporations are really given that much incentive to be back at home, we've got like, I mean, as you guys can attest to, like too, like, I mean, if you've, been to Detroit, I mean, we have all the infrastructure. These things don't necessarily take years. And we also have the dynamics of what's been happening where with higher education, where basically, women are more likely to get degrees. There's this huge like underemployed workforce, a potential workforce of young men. So we have the laborers to actually go into the factories. And if it's incentivized, we could potentially be paying people more. I mean, we'd have to be making them here because if China's really doing these like insane reciprocal tariffs and this just keeps going, in a way, the US could sort of can get through it because not to get into any political side, but if we do that, we have the infrastructure to do everything. Like we're energy self-sufficient. We have enough land to do it. We have all of the old factories that faded away within the last 30 years. So we actually have these things. I mean, if you go around most of the country, you can see these old factories are still there, and those things were built proper to begin with. So I don't think it has to be short term that just goes in perpetuity. I think if those companies are really incentivized, we can weather that, especially with the Europeans, because Europe in a way needs us, like they rely on the cheap Chinese goods as well, but they also need the US marketplace for their exports, unless they just decide they're never going to export product. So if they just decide to, go on credit, then we could have longer term pain. But I think Europe in general is going to kind of like fall in line with what the Trump administration is trying to do. My thought.
Tell me, you mentioned something, and it's something I think is not much discussed, is what manufacturing in the US would look like if it actually does come back. So it's really interesting to hear that the fact that we have a lot of this existing infrastructure really would work to our benefit, to the US benefit rather. Is the main industry supercomputers, or is it something else as well?
No, I think we would be doing, I mean, again, not to go into like what one thinks of Elon Musk, but I mean, he is someone who basically created a competitive product that's manufactured in the US, or mostly. Obviously, there's components, and you could get into like the old school, like designed by Apple, designed in the US or designed in California, manufactured in Asia, or whatever. But I think that we could potentially bring back like the auto industry, because especially having a car guy that tied into the administration, obviously he's going to be biased to try to make this look like a world of Tesla. But even that wouldn't be that bad if that allows him to make an inexpensive Tesla, and it basically, I don't want anything that reeks of socialism, but it could become something where like Tesla becomes a state car and there's a $30,000 Tesla, because I could see them incentivizing it to that level, and all the infrastructure that we didn't do. And every administration says they're going to do this, but like the whole, Biden putting money into bridges and so I haven't seen any of this stuff. Like I didn't see, like, I don't know if this is just the bureaucracy takes that money because obviously money was spent, but there's no indication like, if there was like a World's Fair and you see, okay, here's how the city changed. If there's an Olympics, the city improves, like, wherever, like the host city. I haven't seen any of that with these programs in the past. But this might be the one time it could work. That's the optimist take. Now, the pessimist take is that everything falls apart. The corporations just sort of try to cut their losses and just basically, do their whole market as like, okay, I'm going to just not do business in the US. Like, because we could have corporations that actually leave the US over this too. I don't see any.
Well, I mean, sorry. Are there incentives right now? Like, are they offering incentives? Because
it's chaos, but I think there would be. Like,
right.
because part of what they're doing is like they're throwing out this. I mean, I can't believe he actually did it. Like, I thought Trump was going to do the sort of famous like American paper tiger thing where he's going to say it and use it just as a talking point to speak to like Braddock PA or something, and that's where like the John Fetterman types would be like, oh, like. I get where Trump is coming from. I just thought it was like lip service, and I'm very surprised that he's actually doing it. Like, because if you think about the last time, the first time he ran, the first time he was president, he said a lot of things, and the perception was he did all this crazy stuff, but he really didn't do much. It's basically status quo. if anything, him and Jimmy Carter are the only presidents in my lifetime who didn't start wars. So he was sort of like a Jimmy Carter figure in the sense where we didn't start wars, but he was fairly ineffectual, like policy really hadn't changed that much. Now we could say what he did with the courts, that is the long-term, change. But in terms of the individual policies that he put in play during the first 4 years, I don't think they really were there. But this time, he's going for it, and I can, who knows how this is going to play out at this point. But I do think it's interesting. I don't know if you guys heard Bill Maher talking about Trump, and he met with Trump, and I was like, Bill Maher's even starting to read the room that, hey, maybe this is all like, and I like Bill Maher. It's like that was a very surreal thing.
Wait, Tom, do you like Bill Maher? I don't feel like he's your type.
On individual things, I think he's sort of lazy on some of the facts and stuff, but I like the overall sort of role of him having like at least ostensibly having people on both sides. I mean, I'm also in the first show, when I was like, late teens and Politically Incorrect was on, I thought he would really cover things in a cool way. And I like the fact that he would see like the dude from like Smash Mouth talking to like, I don't know, like some famous economist or something. I don't know, I'm trying to think of, but you'd have these like pairings that were really interesting.
Something kind of going back to Trump blinking. I know that when he was it a week ago now? It feels like a lifetime ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago. I don't know. When he did announce the pause, and I listened to Jeffrey Sachs religiously, and then also Yanis Varoufakis. I love them, and both of them are kind of divergent on this recent trade war. Varoufakis is convinced that Trump will win, just given China and then also Europe will want access to the U.S. market. Sachs believes that Trump announced the pause just because the loss in, I guess, the bond market, I guess rather maybe the pullout from China, since they owed so many U.S. bonds. Do you have any thoughts on this very convoluted question?
It does segue nicely into most of the European nations were open to a discussion. So he kind of has a good excuse for pausing it because they were still being conversational and they weren't coming back with like the petulant response from China. And not that, like I get it on both sides, but those arrangements, like one of the things when that was opened up post NAFTA, that whole era was like, because that opened up the world, it got all the, South America, everybody just like our trade. But the biggest piece of that was what China looked like. And there was definitely a sense that we were going to be able to export our goods at the same ratio. And that never happened. And if you look at like, I don't know, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about like even down to like, if you want to pay with your credit card in China, right? You now need this third party that the state has installed. And now that third party makes money off if you try to use your Visa or Amex in China. So that's like how not competitive it is, that you can't even use your own apps. You can't use and there's a very systematic way of doing that. And the US just played it very because we do have at least, I mean, maybe not anymore, but at least somewhere in the DNA, I think is some true essence of capitalism. And we can argue when that's not happening and when it's crony capitalism and when we're socializing the gains and we're socializing the losses and privatizing the gains. We can, talk about all the times that happens, but I do think we were very surprised that market didn't open up in a similar fashion to how we would expect, right? So when we set up business in Ireland, it helps the US companies and vice versa, right? China doesn't operate that way. And I think that it's been a huge loss for American manufacturers. And then now to see Bernie Sanders basically decrying the tariff policies because poor people can't buy their garbage at Target, and they have to, and I'm not criticizing someone for having to shop there, that it's more expensive to buy things, but the whole reason they're in this predicament is that this policy happened and there's no manufacturing here. So everybody got addicted to the cheap goods that ironically fall apart in a year anyway. So we're in this, and it's a cycle, and if you're reliant and you have a family, this is catastrophic. So these tariffs are very scary. And I don't think the way Trump is going about it is the right answer. But I do think there has to be some teeth in it. Otherwise, we never change the course of this. And I think you can already see the tie-in that everyone in our government has with the government of China. And it is really something that they're setting our policy. And like to see Bernie Sanders completely on that side right now is really frightening because he was like one of the last voices against like these corporations. And now he's basically put his lot in with those billionaires rather than the American billionaires. And we could argue, the billionaires influencing Trump's policy and everything else, and they've got something to gain. But I would rather those gains be here, than a country that, has all of the, myriad human rights issues and things that we're looking at that no one wants to talk about because it's this dichotomy. It's like this black and white. It's like this guy's evil and this is it, and like, but there's much more nuance in between. And I think that's where like, like symbolically, like an RFK Jr. being involved on, healthcare side is kind of interesting because you have these guys who are like very, very old school left wing now are getting into this populist bent of what this president does. So
It makes me wonder, do you think that there was any other way to go about this? Do you think that as you mentioned, this policy needed teeth? Do you think that given that we've gone this far and that like Americans really are addicted to these low cost goods imported from China, that there was any other way to reform besides something so harsh?
I think and this may have happened behind the scenes, but Trump did this so rapidly that I suspect it did not happen. But I think the way would have been to talk to China behind the scenes, maybe bring it up to the very, have Trump personally involved in those conversations and say, listen, I was elected to do this. I'm going to do this. Let's try to come up with something that's a compromise. And maybe it looks like a tariff of this, or maybe we don't do tariffs at all. And you agree that we're going to open Google back up to China, or Alphabet is the parent company now, right? So China opens Alphabet up because the fact that like Alphabet isn't in China and most of China, like that's crazy, So, like if they can push out corporations of that power, we can't even get rid of TikTok here, but they can get rid of Alphabet like it's nothing. They're just like, okay, done, So that level, I think there could have been a conversation behind the scenes because also at some point without the US market, they can't make the difference up in Europe. I think that they think that we're going to cave, but I don't know. I didn't even think he was going to do it to this level. Like I said, I genuinely didn't think he was going to do it. I thought it was just all like bluster. But now that he's done it, he wants to save face. So Trump's not going to come back and be like, oh, I made a mistake. He's never going to do that. So there has to be some major concession at this point. And maybe they tried that behind the scenes, but the rapid nature of how they made this decision and action, I mean, it's crazy. Like I've never seen the stock market tank like this. I mean, this is like, like certainly before I was trading, I guess we could say like 9/11 and COVID, but this felt like much more serious in the sense because even during COVID, it's like they blew up the economy, but the world's economy went at the same time. So then you could go like, hey, all the nations print money. We can keep these corporations afloat. It didn't feel scary to have your dollars in the US market. Now I still feel like US equities are the safest investment, but I don't feel it as strongly as I did 3 weeks ago,
This is awful. You kind of answered this question earlier, but I just kind of want to reiterate it again. Like this has been phrased as a tariff war. And what do you think winning the war would look like, specifically towards China?
I think the winning the war would look like if we could even just get back to what the trade situation looked like at the tail end of the 90s in terms of proportion, right? So even tail end of the 90s, early aughts, we were still getting the overwhelming amount of our goods were not made in the US. This was already, well needed. If we could just get to that level, and then that sort of sets the tone, because then the consumer gets used, because it's obviously going to lead to more expensive goods and services, right? So that happens, people get used to it, but in some way, then we really have more disposable income because now people have to be here and work, right? And so those jobs coming available. And I do think some of the underemployment thing for young men is that there's just like imagine, if you're 22 years old and someone's like, oh, you can go make Teslas or you can make a Ford or you can get some customer service thing or you can't even get that now because that's in like, there's not really a job for you to do. Like basically our only product is making food. So what do? You work in a restaurant? Or like, so I do think there's a bunch of unemployed people who would jump at the opportunity to work in a factory. And I know that sounds very pretentious and condescending, but I really feel like that's a cool gig, especially the era of, the auto workers union. And you look at like, or even now, if you do look at the guys who work at building Boeing, and we can talk about Boeing's problems or, those manufacturers, I mean, they all have good benefits. They have families, they have houses. Like I think a young man who had an opportunity to that. And I do feel like it's largely, and it would help everyone, but I do think really what we're looking at like is in 10 years, women are going to be all like in the workforce and guys are not going to school. like it's just, I see that and I think this is potentially some way to stop that. Because it's like you want everybody working, certainly. But I think like a 22-year-old who can kind of like scrape by and they're living in their parents' basement, are they happy? No, but are they going to be happier working at Jack in the Box while they still live in their parents' basement? It's like, so if you can start like at a $60,000 a year salary on an assembly line and there's some dignity and you can be like, oh, I made that product. I don't know. Maybe that's just like detached, but I mean, at some point that was the American experience and it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great takeaway because something that we talk about on the show is this manosphere, which I'm sure that you've heard about, and like really that young men are attracted to people like, I mean, Theo Vaughn is kind of the joke, but also like obviously Jordan Peterson is big, and really, Trump has allegedly benefited from that as being this, in a sense, like a leader to these disenfranchised young men, disenfranchised in quotes, but I think there is some reality to this and lack of direction and the life of young men, particularly, especially if you're seeing stats like, that women are, more likely to go to school, thus probably more likely to get a high paying job. So again, it sounds insane to think that like factory jobs will again be available, but that could become an avenue for employment and then thus building a life, rather than going to some very expensive university and then starting out at $30,000.
Yeah, and also to this point, it seems like an abstraction because we're so far removed from when we made things.
Hmm.
If you think about like how quickly our corporations can set up a manufacturing place anywhere in the world. It's like how Apple had already started moving a lot of their manufacturing because of the suicides in China, but they had already started moving a lot to India. So here you have a, soup to nuts, you're building this factory, outside, in like I'm just trying to think of like there's one anecdote I was going to bring up, but I can't remember the specific town. But basically, they start setting up factories where there's never been a factory. People who've never even heard of what factories are, and within a span of like a couple of years, you have a full workforce. The towns are revitalized. They're making product much cheaper for Apple than Apple would do manufacturing here. But the more these types of like policies play out, I mean, maybe they would be able to do some manufacturing here. Like if NVIDIA can figure it out, Tim Cook, especially Tim Cook as a supply chain guy and being very keen on logistics, there's going to be a point where the numbers make sense for him to be like, okay, we can make this piece of hardware in the US and it's cheaper for us. And I don't think it has to take that long. And I don't think it's crazy to be like, we can do manufacturing because you don't need a skilled workforce. If anything, manufacturing is easier today than it was 30 years ago. So you have automation, which, yeah, maybe you could say there's less jobs because of the automation, but we still need a lot of physical laborers, as the Foxconn factories can attest, and like why they go through so many people and they have them live at the factory. Like, because even China has trouble with the amount of work they need. They need so many people. So even with the tech, we're still, I think, 10 years off minimum for the full automation of any of this stuff. So
I wanted to amend something that I said earlier. I think that you had mentioned it as well. It's just that a lot of those entry-level jobs, I think, are going to disappear, given the rise of AI. So, I mean, yeah, I think that there's been a lot of talk about trade schools over the past 10 years, and I think obviously this is just another route to that. I wanted to also talk about Bernie Sanders. He's come up a few times in this conversation, and I know before this interview, you shared that Matt Taibbi podcast with Walter Kern about Bernie's kind of flip on tariffs and really just stance on China and manufacturing in general. Would you mind giving an overview of what was in that podcast, and then we can dive in?
yeah, so I mean, I alluded to it too, as you said. It's Bernie's whole approach was, if we sell out the American workforce, if we sell out manufacturing in the cost and the chasing of cheap, low quality goods, ultimately we're chasing after this and our standard of living drops and his constituency ends up not being able to pay their bills, and it increases like poverty, homelessness, everything across the board. And this is literally what's happened in the intervening years. where all these towns have disappeared. I mean, every time, I mean, I was just in, I was just traveling recently and I was in the middle of nowhere and you could see like the skeletons of what a town was. And everybody has these stories now. And all you have left are like a McDonald's, maybe like a kind of decrepit department store. And these are all real things. And then you have, some mega box store that's like outside of this town that everyone has to drive through to get everything. And I think Bernie Sanders was uniquely positioned back in the day where he was tied into these things and very aware of the short-term benefit of like manufacturing cheap overseas to US corporations and their bottom line is not only an immediate disenfranchisement of like the workers here, but long-term it's catastrophic. And somehow he's like flip-flopped on that perspective. And I used to talk about Bernie Sanders as I always think of this, and maybe Ben, you can think of this now that you have like a little one, but I think of this of the book, The Lorax, which is like the Lorax to me is like a book about bad salespersonship because the Lorax goes up to everyone, hey, maybe don't cut the tree down, maybe don't do this, and the whole environment is just falling apart, and he just keeps warning everyone. But he's like the worst at selling. He's just like, please don't do this, and like at the end of it, it's just nothingness, right? And I always thought Bernie Sanders was the Lorax, where he was saying the right thing, but it was so ineffectual in terms of moving the needle. But now he's not even the Lorax. Now he's like as if the Lorax had been like, oh, this was actually a good thing, and now we have these cheap goods, so let's not replant the trees because that would cost money, and let's not make things here because to make things here, it's going to be more expensive to buy them. Like it's just a complete insanity of like, I don't even understand it, and I don't know if it's just that he wants to be relevant within the party, and this message coming from him has so much value that they're just incentivizing him that he keeps his seat or whatever this looks like. But it's like absolutely surreal to me that he's arguing that this is a bad thing.
Something that I've been chatting about with on this podcast and with various people is the Democrats are doing nothing in my mind. And the only people that of the Democrats that are doing something to resist Trump seems to be Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez. Unfortunately, I feel like both of their images have been burned, especially after the 2024 endorsement of Biden without any stipulations on what Biden should pursue in a policy objective. Tom, I don't know how you feel nowadays about politics or where you're really aligning, but what do you think a resistance to Trump would look like? Or do you think Trump has become a socialist? I don't know. What's your opinion of the landscape now is?
I think the only reason Trump won is populism. And I think, it's sort of strange because originally the Republicans were populists. Then they became these corporate, Reagan guys. Then the Democrats got the idea, oh, let's be corporate stooges too. And Bill Clinton basically is Reagan light, so that's where this shift happened and losing that whole base. So I think it's populism and that's how you bring it back because I think a lot of people voted for Trump over, I don't want to be in the wars, they voted over like COVID policy, government shutdowns, like, shutting down various industries. I don't know if they signed up for thinking that this tariff thing was to be this level, but they certainly knew Trump was going to do tariffs, at least rhetoric-wise. So I feel like it could be relatively easy to beat him because all you need is an actual real populist. You just need someone saying, hey, the reason, and then speak to that. But here's how I would go about it. Here's how I would change your manufacturing base. And we would have these programs or incentives or something to help people as they transition, because if the cost of goods and services does go up to do this, this is what this looks like. But now you have a long-term plan rather than being beholden to like the whims of China. Because right now, if we can't make things here, they could institute a tariff anytime they want. It doesn't have to be Trump in place. Like when we're totally dependent on their goods and services as we are now, it's like, that's it. I mean, one of the things they talked about on the Walter Kern, Matt Taibbi podcast is with the drug manufacturing, but like during COVID, I forget which company in China, but they were basically saying, we'll give you all your tests. We'll test all of your samples for you. We'll help you. We'll give you these, vaccines. But basically, they're collecting everyone's data, So what do they do with that information? Does that mean it's nefarious? I don't know. But I would have issue with even a US corporation deciding I'm going to take the world's DNA and what are they going to do with that? I'm sure US corporations have done that, right? But just knowing that should give people pause. But I think back to the political thing, I think if there really is a populist playing out, that's the way to beat Trump. And I think he could be beaten very easily, because if they didn't have original, with Biden being so diminished and it being so late in the game till he finally stepped out. And it wasn't just that debate. I mean, it was clear if you watch, obviously if you watch Biden when he was vice president, he would have gaffes, but he made sense. Like I felt like he was a likable person. And but one of the things as a symptom of when there's Alzheimer's or adjacent symptoms is you get very angry. And he had this level of anger where he's just lashing out. And it was also like diagnostically, everybody could tell there was something off. And that didn't have to play out that long, if at all. Because I think they knew it even during COVID when he basically didn't do any events, So yeah, I think he's beatable, going back to the Trump thing, but
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, and Ben's gonna hate me for saying this so much, but like I was reading this Economist op-ed by Scott Bissett, the trade representative under the Trump administration, and he's talking about the reason for the tariffs, the reasons for the trade war. I'm like, oh yeah, that actually sounds pretty reasonable. But again, it's one opinion, and I don't know the Democrat counterpoint to this. I don't know what they stand for anymore, whether it's on trade or really just governance in general.
Yeah, that's my problem. And I try not to be like beholden to either party, but I feel it's really tough when there's no anti-war voice. There's no pro-working class voice. It's surreal. Like there's like nothing. I mean, like they were during the campaign when they were going after Trump for suggesting that he would end the Ukraine war. Just like what? Like that's something to go at. Like when would the Democrats go after someone for trying to end the war? And especially like that war, because the only way this ends is basically Ukraine doesn't take the southern territory. They agree not to be in NATO. That's what's going to happen. I've been saying that for years, and that's the end result. And then they will have killed a generation of young men to do what? To have that same policy,
No one had to die. That we knew this was going to be the result. The war didn't have to happen.
Yeah, it's so evil. And the way that they're going to try to spin it. I mean, also, like, it should be an indicator, like, again, when Trump won, I think if you're looking at, like, a campaign when you have the Dick Cheney and Lynn Cheney endorsing the Democrat, that's a problem. Like, that policy, like, Biden basically was the same Bush policies. And not even the first Bush, like, and that's what I find so interesting is, like, when the policies are exactly the same. And I think that that's the only way that this stops is like we need someone who is like completely outside of it. I think would actually get through and get the nomination, because I think if they could get traction, the Democrats would line up behind them and they could be shamed into behaving better. Like if there was an equivalent to like Trump type on the left, they would fall in line behind that person. That's like how desperate they are. But they're too scatters right now with like which perspective or which side to go with, because it should be a coherent message on the tariff thing and they're all over the map. It should be a coherent message on the war thing and then, there's no good answer there. Plus there is a split over Israel, that policy on the left. So you've got like the establishment side that's very pro policy of Netanyahu, and like that in of itself could just put the kibosh on the whole party getting elected again, which really.
Well, I mean, even Bernie won't even gesture towards changing his opinion on Israel when it comes to that, even at his. I find it to be really phony, fight the oligarchy protests that they're having.
Yeah, well, that's what's weird. They're like they're talking about like all everybody's saying like no kings and stuff. It's like, what do you think we just experienced? Like this basically, we've already had all these administrations that started war without a formal declaration of war. Like, W. Bush, basically started this policy of like preemptive war, but we've continued that. I just can't. I mean, we basically had a king for all this time now. So why this time it's different, I don't know. I mean, is he less articulate and perhaps scarier to hear speak? Certainly. Does it make anybody feel good when you know? But I don't know. Like it's just strange that they didn't realize like when someone is telling them you have to take this drug, you have to like that's okay versus now. I mean, I don't know. Like I just feel like what we've gone through certainly since COVID has been policies across the board where like you don't have choice in what you're doing, and if you're speaking out on the wrong side of politics, they'll figure out a way to get here. Or if you look at what like the jailing journalists and everything that happened with Julian Assange, this is crazy. That like there's now they're talking about kings. It's like where have you been?
Tom, are you surprised that Trump has allowed the stock market to dip so much, even in the short term?
Yes, totally surprised. My thesis for this year was like totally wrong because I went all in on a lot of stuff because I thought, this is what he was going to do. And like, because I really thought, because he would always, that was his style of tweeting. He'd be like, look, I did the right thing because the stock market went up. Like he always looked at that. But now, I don't know. I don't know if it's like this revitalized Steve Bannon advice or something. Like now that Steve Bannon took a shower and is like cleaned up and is like, I don't know. He's like, they're all like coming in this like.
There's that Rothschild's quote that's when there's blood on the streets, buy. I mean, do you think that's good advice?
I'm doing it, but I don't feel good about it. I don't like he's now proven like Trump has proven so unpredictable that I don't know how to really, because the market hates uncertainty famously. And I think that's where we're at, like is the most uncertain. And ironically, I shouldn't feel this because he said he was going to do this. Like, but this was the one thing he actually did that he said he was going to do. So yeah, I would still cautiously say buy because I don't think there's a safer place in the world to put money. And we're still, who knows what inflation is going to look like in any of these circumstances, right? Because we're talking like if the dollar's, already people are not relying on US currency. Maybe it becomes this crypto thing. But then we're also with the AI component. I also think is to get really like metaphysical and really, as I tend to do. I don't know, like I think at some point where no one's really working within 15 years anyway. Because I think like this tech is such that like it's gotten, I'm sure you guys have like, used ChatGPT in the way that this is improved within months it's better, within weeks it's better. Eventually this shit starts starting its own corporations, figures out how to manufacture, and like you're gonna have these entities and they're gonna find out, I've been doing business with, Acme products out of Anaheim and that's actually, there's no person involved in this. And they're gonna like, I think we're at this level. And when that all comes to fruition, because you can't put the brakes on it once this is started, the only way, like people will just be like on some kind of universal basic income, or they'll figure out how to tap everyone into the matrix and you'll just have like a protein pellet that feeds you for years. And we're just on an electronic grid and it's like some hellscape, but I don't think people will be working 15 years from now. I think it's all going to basically, they're just going to have to pay people to keep the peace. And what fortunes look like is going to seem like nothing. So if someone's worth $10 billion versus a $2 billion fortune versus someone who's got 50K versus someone who makes 15,000 a year at Walmart, those strata are going to rapidly disappear because everyone's going to kind of more exist in the virtual world anyway. And, I don't know, hopefully that doesn't happen, but it feels like that's kind of, I don't know if I've read too much PKD, but still.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, but I mean, it kind of feels inevitable at the moment, just given how much ChatGPT has, as you mentioned, improved. You can see it, I think, weeks is right, if not days. Tom, have you been following the Trump's moves with crypto?
No, I need to get more into that part of it. Like, there's so much this administration's been doing that I am like, I will say, like, I've been holding crypto in terms of, oh, I meant to tell you, so last time I was on the podcast, was I right or was I not right about DOGE? Like,
Yes, yeah. Can you revive what you brought up and then talk a little bit more about it?
yeah,
Wait, I
so
forgot about this. What did you say about Doge?
I was telling everybody to buy Dogecoin. And the week after that podcast, it was this insane return. It was up like, I forget the numbers, but it was like fortunes were made. And obviously it's gone back down. But the time period after that podcast, Doge was on like this tremendous tear. It was nuts.
Well, we are going to end with some stock some stock advice from you. So we want to know what to buy. We want to know what to sell. This is just for Dan and I, by the way, because it takes us like a week to get these out. So by the time it actually airs, your advice will be meaningless.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm only going to get things that I think make sense over like, for the time, because I don't want to be like caught, like if it posts in a week and they're like, what did this guy say? And then I'm like Jim Cramer or something. Well, incidentally, I actually like Jim Cramer, but like in that role, he's had some doozies, but anybody would know. you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Wait, so yeah, you're telling us about Doge, and I mean like let's talk about Musk a little bit. Are you surprised that this wasn't just a I don't know, full of shit. He wasn't full of shit like this that Doge is actually happening?
Hmm. I'm surprised that they gave him the power to do it.
Hmm.
You know, I figured because Trump a lot of times will promise people the moon and to get their endorsement, to get their support, and then he like lets them down, but then they never publicly shame Trump because they feel like they're going to need Trump again. But this seemed actually like a lot of the crazy. I don't even think it's all crazy. So let me preface that. I think it's fashionable to say Elon Musk is crazy. I think a lot of the things he was talking about for years, he got Trump to do, and I think he was in Trump's ear. So I think like the first administration, Trump just filled it up with like neocons and John Boltons of the world, and that basically he had the wherewithal to put the brakes on the starting the war thing. But administratively, like you effectively had those same what would be the same policymakers who thought this stuff was a good idea and thought Trump should be, creating more bloodshed in the world, and they were going to go after Trump after the fact, right? But I think this was everything in line of what Elon asked for, and I'm surprised because I was surprised at the nature of the tariffs. I was surprised there wasn't just a threat. So think it's all pretty much followed what Elon's recommended. And I think one of the things that's interesting in terms of the cuts that Doge is doing, like obviously you're going to find things that they shouldn't have cut, but there's a lot of things that they've gotten rid of that you're like, oh my God, like somebody was getting paid this for like, I mean, it's just crazy the amount of money that's in this. And maybe, you can say, oh, this, is nothing like our defense budget. I don't know, because so much of it is lost. It's like when we were in Iraq the first time. Well, actually, no, was this in Iraq or, yeah, actually both countries had this, but both Iraq and Afghanistan they just lost like suitcases full of money. Like, they try to bribe people in various governments. And, there was billions upon billions of dollars that are just lost just in that, like in a week, right? So there's warlords in Afghanistan who probably have became billionaires you know, from that. And we didn't even know who we were dealing with or we were giving the money for, right? So if you can use AI to go through and at least see what we have records of, you can definitely clean up what's happening. And I also like that the emphasis isn't to go after the little guy, at least thus far, right? So they could also use that to go back at the American public and find everyone who's underpaid their taxes. I can find every mistake that was ever made on a tax return and just rake in the money, and then we don't have a deficit anymore. Like, think about every time someone has done taxes, like if there's a casual mistake, and then you add to that. I don't want to say I'm in favor of all the cuts that they're making, but I think big picture it makes sense to like trim the fat and clean that stuff up. And hopefully they don't just put the eye back on the American public and then say, because at some point I'm sure there's a voice and they're like, oh, look at all these guys who didn't pay taxes. And I don't want them to get on that side of it, because then it turns into like, because like anything else, they won't just go after the ultra wealthy. The ultra wealthy will have some way around it, and you'll be picking up the taxes from what's remaining of the decimated middle class and poor people. So as long as they don't use the AI back in that direction. So.
I absolutely think they will do that, by the way things are going.
Well, I think because they're not going to find enough money, or they're going to be like, we can't cut this.
Well, this is the thing, and I don't know if I'm not going to phrase this as a question because I don't know if anybody has an answer to this, but like you said, yeah, they are finding some silly expenditures that they're getting rid of, and like that's all well and good, but then also, turning the Pentagon budget into $1 trillion now, which I don't know how much it was before. I already kind of thought it was $1 trillion, but that's nothing new. The Pentagon budget goes up every year and always has. But one thing I wonder about whenever they're talking about, oh, look at all this money we saved, especially coming from a Republican institution or administration, I can only think, so what? Like, to what end? Like, you saved money, but like, what does that actually mean for the average person when it's coming from an administration that has absolutely no interest in providing any kind of social welfare? It's kind of the same, similar to the question I have about the carrot and stick for manufacturing. It's like, oh, okay, you're penalizing not having factories here, but you're not incentivizing it yet. So I don't see what there is to be happy about Doge in that. I mean, I'm sure you remember a couple months ago when it was floated that he was going to send a check to every American citizen, and when you did the math, how much they had actually saved at that point, it was like a $1.50 or something was going to go to every single person. So I don't know. But any thoughts on that?
Um, Unfortunately, like I agree with you. I don't see them really using any of these things. If they save us money, it's not like they're going to pass that along to the American public. I mean, it's sort of like Dave Chappelle. I think it was Chappelle was making this comment, but he's like, when they're talking about like during COVID and everybody's getting this, effectively a UBI during the months of COVID. If you've ever had a job, right, like you're getting this check. And he's like, wait, you mean you guys could have been doing this the whole time and you weren't doing it and people are starving? Why didn't you do this the whole time? It's like, that's urgent, And it's like true because like there are people who couldn't afford to eat. And like that seems like, that should have been like some kind of motivation to have these types of programs when we effectively could do it all. I just think this notion of like what they can do versus what they will do are like so far removed. And it is a sad thing because their emphasis is not on, I think it's like on the country overall is what like we need to make things and that part's great, but they're not at like the quality of life for the most of the people who live in the country is not an emphasis. So.
Yeah, it seems to me right now that the emphasis is on maintaining the supremacy of the American empire, right? Like, making sure that we're the biggest stick in the world. But now it's clearly, it always was, I think, in my opinion, but now it's clearly to the detriment of American citizens. So to me, it's like, aside from having bragging rights of we're the biggest, baddest military, I don't see the utility in any of this.
I agree. I don't think there is. And I think that, there is that dichotomy between, Trump basically not wanting to start wars, but being so pro-military industrial complex, right?
Yeah, the handsome generals.
Yeah, it's a very weird, exactly. It's a really weird scenario. And I also feel like when you have these weapons and systems, and it's like, I don't know, like it's some kind of superstition thing, but you want to use it. There's a human nature, got this force armed to the teeth. You start looking for nails. You're like, I need to do this, and I'm gonna like,
yeah.
And
why have it?
Like what's going on, Because the deterrent, even with the deterrent, I mean, largely we really could just make a policy of not and say we did. Like we could say our standing army is this, and there's no way anyone's gonna be able to verify that. We could like, all those things they don't have to. We put this in,
Yeah, we could just lie. That's true.
And the rest of the world can't keep up with, I mean, they can't carry the sort of debt we can because our debt, at least thus far, being backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, we can do these things. Most countries can't, right? So like they can't really match us anyway. Even if we just stopped the growth in military, if we just kept it where it is even, I'd be happy with that. But no one's even willing to do that. So
Tom, I was just thinking about, do you feel like similarly with RFK, now leading the, HHS, do you feel like there is, again, they're making these cuts, they're trying to pursue these policy agendas, but without providing socialized healthcare, universal healthcare?
yeah, I mean, I don't see any like, but they would argue there's going to be some version of that's what Obamacare is. It's not, as anyone who's been on Obamacare can attest.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think him being in the role is the most like punk rock cool thing that's ever happened to me because he is the true believer in that and like completely, I think, coming from a good place with it. And especially like it's fun to vilify all these people, but really like him on a policy level, he's like, I just want them to not have full immunity from prosecution. I just want them to have a control group if they're going to introduce a drug to the public. I do think we should maybe question if we're putting all these vaccines for the cost of, for efficiency in terms of price point, and so they can have bigger margins. Like, I think those are relevant things. And I think it is telling that all this stuff really was pushed through, like, to the way we know it under, like, Reagan, like, really started pushing this. Policy-wise, like, it is concerning. Like, the amount of, like, vaccines they try to give, like, when, my daughter's been vaccinated, but, like, when she was born, they're trying to give her, like, STD vaccines. Like, why is she taking a drug for an STD at birth if the mother doesn't have the STD? Like, why is that? And, like, And you should have seen the administrators like she doesn't need this. Why would I give her like? It's just so I do think policy wise, it's pretty major having RFK in the role. And do I like that he's stopping and eating roadkill and all the little crazy stuff? Yeah, I mean but that's going to be they're going to do that with anyone. But I do think, if anything, just to hold them to those standards as you would with any other product, I think would be fantastic. And then I think they would pause. I think like when you get back into the research and you find out that these things were never vetted properly, and I'm not anti, I mean, again, there's these major vaccines. I'm not saying vaccines don't work. I just think that it's too tempting for them to find a new flavor and to be like, oh, look, we came up with this one now and you need this. You know, you get to this like during COVID, if you're giving like young people a vaccine for a disease that they're not at risk of dying from, and we don't know the full risk profile for the vaccine, I think those are valid questions. Not that like someone shouldn't have the right to take those, but in terms of mandating that to go to university for something that they're not at risk for, you know, and even that, it's taken 5 years for people to go, oh yeah, the young people weren't at risk for this thing. Like that was a controversial statement up until very recently. Now it's like, oh yeah, of course I wouldn't do that. But you know, there's still universities mandating that, and there's still people who are, you know, for something that arguably. So that side of the debate I think is okay. But you're right. What do these policies really matter if we don't really have some form of socialized medicine or like everybody has coverage? You know, or the other option would be if we did go back to the era where your general physician or doctor was like low cost. Like if you look at before all the HMOs came in, like really before like Nixon policies, like, you know, if I talked to my parents, you would pay out of pocket for the doctor, but it was never some catastrophic thing. And then you have insurance would be for hospital stays for something serious. So your general maintenance isn't bad. You're paying $100 here and there, $50, right? Because the market dictates. So you can go to the cheapest doctor if you want, or you go to a specialist. And then your real insurance kicks in if you need surgery. And that way of doing business worked for really well. We had good healthcare in the country. Like we had a very good system. People were not complaining about it, and they had access to all this stuff. And then somehow that extra level of greed of like, let's make it so it can happen like this. So, you know, not to, you know, get into like the United Healthcare thing, but like all of these things are because of these policies. So I think if anything, maybe in a roundabout way, RFK would help with that, because at least it gets people like hip to the idea of like, how did we get here, you know?
Well, I wanted to ask one last question, but really, you know, speaking of Bill Maher, to bring it back to Bill Maher, Bannon was on last weekend, and he said that expect a tax increase on the super wealthy. And one, do you think that'll happen? And two, what do you think the market's reaction would be?
I think it will happen. I think there's going to be all these like loopholes and roundabout ways. And I think he's going to on paper say he did this. I don't think the market will necessarily respond in a negative way. If it really had teeth, it would, but I don't think so. And then the other aspect would be, I'm saying if it had teeth, it would. But the other part of that is we do have like a much bigger retail investor presence than we have at any other time. So if the public likes this idea, you know, it's a kind of a weird thing. They might feel more confident putting money into the market because now they feel like they're not enriching the CEO, but they can still bet on their favorite stock. You know, it's like a very weird, you know, because obviously the CEO makes money and these billionaires are going to get more money by putting money back into the stock market. So I don't know. I guess that's not a yes or no answer.
Hey, no, we don't deal in yes and no's here.
Quick ones. So I did say I wanted stock advice. So
Oh, yes, yes.
could I just get some buy or sells?
So
Johnson
I'm
and
going to give you two crypto. For two crypto, these are really basic ones. I would go Bitcoin because crypto in general should eventually show some sort of store of value. You could argue the utility, but I think Bitcoin will see some improvement no matter what happens with this trade policy. Second one I would go with is Ethereum, which is the granddaddy also, which is Vitalik is still a kid, but still like one of the more established ones. And I would go Ethereum because they're all about smart contracts. So we're really looking at like the more automation through AI, you know, I mean, doing real estate, everything like the title abstract, everything is going to be just stored via the blockchain. So Ethereum is really going to own the space. So if you're holding the Ethereum, it's the way to go. And then in terms of stocks, this is a controversial one, and I got burned on this one. They had a great quarter. I really like writing covered calls on Carvana. Carvana has a really big premium. I've been trading this for now this is my third year going into this strategy, but basically I'm long Carvana inadvertently because I would write covered calls. So basically somebody can buy, I'm giving them the right to sell their shares to me at a certain price. Carvana's had some ugliness in the last month. So I've had to buy more shares than I wanted. So I'm holding a lot of it, but I still think Carvana is an interesting play, not because it's a particularly well-run company, but because the options market is inflated. So it's fun to trade. It does get a good move. In terms of stocks to hold long, I would get into NVIDIA. As I mentioned, I think they've got some kind of deal cooking with the administration. So we could get into the socialistic aspect of that. And is that fair? That's a whole other aspect. But I do think NVIDIA knows something everyone doesn't know when they're saying they're going to do the supercomputer manufacturing in the US at all. That's going to happen. I think that there's something cooking with that. So I would just hold it. And then the other picks I would have is reluctantly, you've heard me allude to defense a bunch of times. I think given the crazy rhetoric, I would be getting into Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing and holding that. And also another fun one, get into Exxon, because if we do any of these policies, our control of the oil refining capacity around the world, and even countries that produce their own oil are really reliant on Exxon as a piece of all of that. So Exxon is a very, very good buy right now.
So all the blood in the streets stocks is what
Oh,
you're saying.
one other thing I should add, actually, one other thing, and then also really uninteresting ones that and you guys are younger than me, but my grandparents would always tell me, buy Coca-Cola stock, buy PepsiCo, all of those in your case, these are great grandparents picks. I would recommend getting all of those as well. So all the really, really basic, traditional, consumer packaged goods, because I think our CPG production is going to go off the charts with these tariff policies. And we do have the raw ingredients to make all the food. So I would buy lots of KO stock.
Tom, thanks so much. I'll definitely send you a link after we post.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Next up. That was our conversation with Tom Handischiegal. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Ben.
I'm Dan.
Be sure to like and subscribe, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram. We'll see you next time.